This is how real change happens in the world, Phil. You're at the forefront of it. I'm at the forefront of it. And it all happens where you've got a microphone, where nobody can force you to turn it off, and you speak your truth from a full heart, and you'll attract other people who want to hear what you have to say.
The Phil Bach Podcast. Investing, economics, entrepreneurship.
Welcome back to the Phil Bach Podcast. I am yet again so excited for this show. My guest is Ben Hunt. Ben is the co-founder and partner at Second Foundation Partners and is the author of Epsilon Theory, the Epsilon Theory website, newsletter, and podcast. We previously recorded 2 podcast episodes, which I call Epsilon Theory Part 1 and Epsilon Theory Part 2. In Part 1, we discussed the transformation of capital markets into political utilities. And in Part 2, we walked through a number of the key Epsilon Theory isms, the concepts that Ben always returns to in his writing. This isn't a serial show, so don't worry, you don't have to hear those before listening to this one. But if you want to, I've reposted them both here in this feed and on the ETF Experience feed, so you can go back and give those a listen before we get into the conversation today. Ben is one of the great thinkers of our time, in my opinion, and I'm honored, in my opinion, and I'm honored to bring you this episode where we'll go deeper into how narratives are formed and ultimately how narratives are driving the market. Ben, thank you for joining the show.
It is so great to be back, Phil, and I'm sorry that I kind of laughed out loud about the great thinker comment. I got to have you do all my intros, Phil. That was outstanding.
I'd be happy to do so. We'll go on tour together. So we're going to use the word narrative quite a bit today, and so why don't we start with defining what specifically do you mean when you refer to the narrative?
You know what? I mean it in exactly the way everyone thinks about it. It's a story. It's a story. You know, it may be true, it may be false, but it's some sort of story. It's an arc, arc. It's a path from here to there. It's a description of the why, right? So this is something that we are hardwired for, Phil, as human animals. We are always looking for the why. And if you can tell a compelling story with a beginning, middle, and end about why did the price of, Bitcoin go up today or down today? What's the reason? Explain that to me. It's the most powerful thing in our social lives. And by social lives, I mean our private social lives, certainly with our family and our friends, but even more so, I mean our public social lives, which we find in markets and we find in politics.
There is a zeitgeist that blows around. There's a collective consciousness, which ultimately, drives the conversation. And, it's easy to measure on Twitter. You can see what people are talking about, but it's deeper than that. And it really goes into how we think about, view, frame different conversations. You can see it in, the media, in television, even in movies and things that are produced.
Sure.
How much of that zeitgeist is random and how much of it is intentionally driven?
Well, let me start by describing it this way, Phil. There are only a finite number of what I would describe as narrative archetypes, right? And I'm just going to focus on markets right now, okay? I mean, we're going to talk about politics or anything like that. Well, let me just focus on narratives that we see in the investing world. And when I say there's a finite number, it's not a big number, right? It's not a big number. So, for example, in every movie that's been, major motion picture that's been released over the past, 30 years, there's a structure to it. So there's a 3-act structure, right? You've got Act 1, you've got Act 2, and then you've got the resolution, Act 3. And if you're a screenwriter in Hollywood, don't even bother submitting a script if it doesn't follow that structure. Because that's what we as human animals, that's what we enjoy. That's what we understand. That's how we tell a story. So you've got a structure to every story that's told, whether you're talking about a movie or whether you're talking about a CNBC segment, it's the same thing. But even more than that, so the script itself, I don't know, there are certainly fewer than 100 discrete scripts for describing a stock, a market, an index, right? It's like the Law and Order series, right? Law and Order and all of its different spinouts. I looked it up one time. So Law and Order, the basic Law and Order TV series, has filmed 500 episodes, right? But there are only a dozen scripts. There are only a dozen scripts for 500 episodes. You just, you change the protagonist around. You introduce a different one in Act 1 and then Act 2, and you change the names and the details around, but there are only basically a dozen scripts. It's exactly the same way in our narrative analysis. There are basically a dozen scripts to talk about a CEO, to talk about corporate management, to talk about what works in the environment today. And so your question was, how much of this is intentional? A lot of it is. A lot of it is, Bill. And I don't necessarily mean that in a conspiratorial, smoke-filled room kind of way. The way I mean it is that highly successful politicians, highly successful public personas in markets, right? Whether that's a Kramer or whether that's a CEO like Mark Benioff, right? Or somebody who starts and builds a successful asset manager, Larry Fink, right? You think Larry Fink doesn't have an instinctive understanding of the structure, the 3-act play structure? You think he doesn't have an instinctive understanding of the finite number of narratives, archetypes that exist for telling a story in markets? I promise you he does. It's not, I'm sure it's not something that he lies awake at night thinking about. I actually don't know Larry very well. I mean, I met him once or twice, but he doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who's sitting in his study late at night and plotting out his narrative campaign, what we used to call PR. But I promise you that he has an innate feel for it, because every public person in markets and in politics today who is successful, they have that innate sense for it. And so you ask, is it intentional? It is learned. It works. And so the longer you're in this business, and if you are competent and successful like those people I named, you pick it up. You've got a skill for it. You've got a talent for it. And you put that all together, and you've got what we have today, a world of narrative where not just on the short term, that's what I used to think. I used to think, it's just narratives in the very short term. Long term, the market's a weighing machine, and all these other things that we've been taught for so long. I don't think that anymore, right? I think that it's narrative all the way down, that it's always a voting machine, that it's always the skill with which these stories and the arc of these stories are told to us in ways that answer that question of why, and so resonate in a way that facts never do. These stories, they impact how we feel. And, whether it's voting or investing, man, that's what drives us. It really is, Phil.
It's amazing now. I mean, I probably should have set the table about how narratives are moving the markets. It's amazing to the degree to which they are. I mean, you look at Bitcoin, you look at GME, right? I mean, the narrative on GME one way, and how the narrative flipped in a war. I mean, it was a war, and the narrative flipped on GME amazingly in one instant, and on and on. And there's no math here. It's not a math equation. And you can see the frustration from value managers and quants and people who've been in the markets for a long time. And they came up, and it was, at least to a very large degree, it was mathematics. It was a math question, right? It was a puzzle. How much is this company worth relative to where it is? How can you tilt the market in your favor by using different quantitative factors, different things? And all of a sudden now you've got these narratives that just blow everything up, right? The Tesla trading at a $700 billion market cap has nothing to do with any fundamental. I mean, there's just no way to defend it other than the narrative of the world moving to, electronic vehicles and their data and all this stuff that have been spun. But it is not.
You know what I find fascinating, Phil? This is the way markets used to be. Right? So the environment that you and I grew up in around markets, right? That it's fundamentals, it's this Graham and Dodd type analysis. Graham and Dodd weren't particularly popular back in their day. I mean, Ben Graham, what? Even if you just go back to the 1950s, right? Or the 1960s, it's everybody reading the tape. It's everybody reading the tape. That was how you made money in markets. That's what it meant to be on Wall Street, right? Go back even a little farther. Go back before World War II. Go back to the Carnegies. Go back to the Vanderbilts. Go back to the Goulds. And you read about what it meant to be on Wall Street back then. Man, nobody's doing discounted cash flow analysis. Are you kidding me? What it was before World War II, what the market meant was that you created stories, a narrative about a stock, and that the way you were a successful investor or speculator, nobody really talked about investing. You were a trader, you were a speculator. Those weren't bad words back then, right? The game of markets was upfront, it was recognized, and the terminology that we still use today, where we talk about, you're going to corner the market. Well, a corner was what you were trying to achieve back in the days of Gould and Vanderbilt and Carnegie. A corner meant that you were able to create a story that got everybody on the same side of the trade. And why do you set up a corner? Well, you set up a corner because you were there on that side of the trade first, so they're all buying from you. And then you set up a corner because then you get on the other side of the trade and you unwind it, right? That's all it is. And the game is both creating these stories, these narratives, creating a corner, and recognizing that others are doing the same to you. Read the memoirs, right? Read the, Reminiscences of a Stock Operator, all this stuff. This is what it meant to play and win at the game of markets. So, it is interesting what's happening today in the sense that a lot of this it certainly feels new and frankly awful to me, right? Charlie Munger yesterday saying, oh my God, Bitcoin's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. I got to tell you, Bitcoin would have been very natural to Jay Gould in 1870. Bitcoin would have been really natural to Commodore Vanderbilt in the 1910s. It's so much what I like to call it the meta story that we're exposed to. Because here's the thing, Phil, value ain't nothing but a story itself. Value is a story also. And it happened to be the dominant story for a long time. Now there's another story. We can talk about what that is or what it could be. But throughout all this time, my view is it's story all the way down.
So for someone who is quantitatively minded, which I think you are at your core, I certainly am. And here's something that you've said recently that you like to say: the real money is made through flows, not price. Right, and you have this great meme. Hey, the what's really driving the market is, flows. Always has been, right? I love that one. And assuming that narrative predicts flows, which we can assume it does. quantifying narratives then becomes the name of the game. If you can quantify narratives and the movement of those narratives better than everyone else, and there's your leg up, and there's not only your leg up, there's your quantitative mathematical leg up that you can feel good about, that you're not just, jumping on GME because some persuasive people on Reddit, you want to get behind, because you have something that you can fall back on that has real quantitative merit. So that brings us to the narrative machine, right? And the narrative maps that you've developed. So what is that process?
So the process is nothing more than externalizing what good traders have internalized since the dawn of time, right? Think about what you just said, right? That what you want to do is you want to, you're not the person starting the GME, I'll call it rumor, narrative, story arc, right? You're not roaring kitty. Right? But what you do is you're watching lots of roaring kitties. You're watching lots of these guys and institutions and hedge funds. You watch lots of them kind of start there. I like to use the snowball analogy, right? They've all got their little snowball that they're trying to roll down the hill. And they're trying to roll it down the hill because they want to turn their little snowball into a big snowball and then into an avalanche, because they're positioned for the avalanche down there at the bottom, right? They're either long or short, whatever that avalanche means for them. Think about what good traders are doing today. Think about we'll use GME, we'll use GameStop as an example. You see the average daily volume on GME? That wasn't retail traders. Are you kidding me? No. It was prop desk, it was hedge funds, it was traders like I'm describing who have internalized this, and they're watching. Let's call it momentum, but we're not talking about price momentum, we're talking about narrative momentum. Right? Then that's what good traders internalize. Some news hit the market. Do I push it or do I fade it? Every trader in the history of the world, that's their job. And good traders internalize that really well. They say, here's a piece of news, here's a story. Does it have legs or do I fade it? That's the question a trader asks him or herself every day, dozens of times a day. Does it have legs? Does this move have legs or do I fade it? So what I'm describing, what I mean by the narrative machine, is to try to study these words, statements, speeches, articles, try to do that systematically to externalize what a good trader has already internalized. Because it's a gift, right? It's a gift as a trader that you're able to understand. Okay, yeah, this news, this statement, I'm going to fade it because it's not going to grow from here. Or you're watching GME, you're seeing the narrative that, it's the little guy sticking it to the man, and you think, yeah, that's got legs. That can work. That can work. We can, squeeze Melvin for that ridiculous short position. This can work. So that's what the research side of my work is about, Phil, is trying to apply the algorithms, the stuff we're applying, the math here. It's pretty basic graph theory, linguistic theory. It's been around for 30 or 40 years. I was doing this in grad school, right? What's different today is that we have the big data, right? We just got the pipe that can give us all this unstructured data, all the text, all the transcripts, all everything like that. We don't need it in, milliseconds. This isn't a fast twitch stat arb strategy, but you've got a big pipe. All this information is collected all over the world, and you can get it from Dow Jones, you can get it from, Reuters, you can get it from, LexisNexis. And what would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars if you could acquire it, if you could collect it. It ain't cheap, but it doesn't break the bank either. Even more importantly, Phil, than big data is what I like to call big compute. It's the ability to tap into AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, whatever these cloud-based services for computing processing power is, and to access computing processing power the same way you'd plug into the wall and get electricity. That changes everything, Phil. Changes everything. I was doing this stuff 35 years ago. God, I got to date myself here. When I was working on this same sort of studies for my dissertation, my first book. And like I say, nothing's changed with the algorithms. What's changed is what used to take me literally months to code, by hand and hiring undergrads and doing all this stuff, and then coding it into some of your listeners will be old enough to remember this, a deck mini frame, right? Right? Yeah. To program that, and then come back in 2 days and let's see, what the run did. I can do that now in 3 seconds. In 3 seconds, what would take me days before, if I could even do it. That's what changes everything, Phil. It lets us be systematic about understanding the structure and the organization of narrative. It's like being given a microscope and being able to look under that microscope at a drop of dirty pond water and see what had been invisible before, to see that there's an entire world there. It's a world we knew existed. We know there's a world of narrative and that it impacts us. But to be able to see it, to be able to study it, to, as you say, to apply just some basic math to it, it's pretty exciting times, Phil. It really is.
So what have you learned? What have you learned about the way narratives move, and some catch fire and some don't? Are there people, individual people, or organizations or channels, or are there, certain ways that these things tend to catch and grow? Are there ways, there are certain people where they just die out? I mean, what have you learned about how narratives take hold that we didn't know?
Yeah, it's when I use that example of looking at that drop of river water under a microscope and seeing a world of living creatures, that's the way I think about it. We talk about a meme going viral, right? That ain't wrong. It's the truth. You can see, you can visualize a narrative structure and the way it's born, the way it grows or not, the way it lives and reproduces or not, the way it'll emerge with another narrative and become really big, or the way it splits and dies. They are like living organisms. And it's, I'm not the only one doing this, right? So Robert Schiller, I know Robert pretty well. I mean, I think he does good work on this stuff. So he wrote the book Narrative Economics. And the core of that book is that the way to apply math to narrative is the same math that we apply to epidemics, right? To real world viruses and their spread. And that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so the words we commonly use, like going viral, that is correct on much more than just a metaphorical sense. These ideas, and this is what the old idea of a meme was, that a meme is, in any kind of meaningful sense, a living thing. Which is a really weird thing to wrap your head around, right? But when you think about, well, what is a living thing, right? They find a way to evolve and survive and multiply and to reproduce. In a weird kind of sense, you can see of human beings as we're just the host for these memes, and the memes are the real living things that are doing what they do in order to survive. It's a really weird way of looking at the world, Phil. I'm not going to lie, to see memes and ideas and narratives as just as much alive as you and I, or just as much you and alive as a bacteria or a virus. But that really is how increasingly I think about the world. It's like seeing a world that's invisible, but we all know it's there. We all know it's there.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, one of the things that I've been really, really upset about mostly over the past year, I guess it's probably been over the past 2 years, unpleasant people, unpleasant topics, so-called deplorables being moved off of the main platforms. And I'm so angry at online censorship because I don't think those conversations go away. I think they move to dark corners where they fester and grow. Are you still able to measure those dark corners of the internet?
This is one of the reasons why I really like to focus on public markets with our application of what we call the narrative machine. Because what the narrative machine looks at, and what I mean by the narrative machine, is nothing more than that combination of big data. You collect all the public statements, and then you apply big compute on that. for finding the connections. You're basically looking for linguistic similarities of language. And that's not a complicated process, like I say, but it is a factorial. It's an enormous process to compare every word to every other word. If something is hidden in the dark, right, whether it's private speech or whether it's just not published or public, no, I can't look at it. It's not there. And to your point, the idea is not going to go away. That idea is not going to go away. Now, I think what we're seeing, Phil, and because I share your just visceral antipathy for the narrowing of what speech is acceptable, right? For the narrowing of this. And on the one hand, I've got to deal with the world as it is, as we all do with investors, right? We're responsible for other people's money. Most of us are. Or it's our family's money, which is another responsibility that's no less, right? But we're responsible for other people's money, people who trust us and are relying on that. So we can't deal with markets as we wish they would be, which personally for me, I mean, I was raised on that gospel of quality. That, yeah, the companies you want to invest in are the ones with a good management team and growing earnings and a fortress balance sheet. And I want to avoid the crap. But given the responsibility we have for other people's money, we've got to deal with the world as it is. And if the world as it is going to be one where narratives are constructed to move crowds in a specific way around specific stocks and indices and sectors, well, you know what? I don't have to agree with it and believe it and accept it in my heart, but as part of my responsibility, I've got to play that game. So what we're trying to do is to play the game we're given, because that's our responsibility. That's the responsibility of a lot of people listening to this podcast. But don't for a second think that means that I'm not in my own life and my company's life and everything else doing whatever I can to break this stranglehold, frankly, that what I like to call is the nudging state and the nudging oligarchy have over our public worlds. I'm not going to tell you, Phil, I think we can do something about it. It's going to take a long time, but it's going to come from the bottom up, and it's going to come from people like you, people like me, people who are listening to this and saying, this isn't right, and taking concrete steps to do the right thing in our own communities and starting it up from the bottom up. I really do believe, Phil, that we can make a real change in our society over a long period of time by doing this. Or at least I got to have that hope, right, Phil? I mean, you got to hope that you can make a change to break this stranglehold over time. Otherwise, we'd really go crazy.
Otherwise, we're in trouble. Yeah. I mean, the book burners have never been on the right side of history, and it's happened so fast. From saying, well, just Milo and Alex Jones, we're just going to, because those guys, we can all agree, those guys really have no place in the conversation. And from that point, we're going to test out just this one, just that one, just anybody who thinks differently about, any number of topics. The speed at which it went from the former to the latter is pretty terrifying. It's pretty terrifying to me, and I think to a lot of people. A lot of people are afraid to speak up. I'm fortunate where I have a little bit of a microphone. I'm not, people that work for large companies really don't have the option to say anything. And we have a society that's becoming increasingly silent, and that's complacent and silent. And that is, I think, a big danger.
You're totally right about that, Phil, and let me point this out to you. You do have a microphone, Phil. You do. And you've been able to find a community of people from all walks of life who share what I like to call a full heart, right? Who can listen to you and probably disagree with you on a good many things. But they can disagree with you. Hell, Phil, I disagree with you on a lot of things, right? But we can disagree with each other without thinking the other person's a bad person. We're thinking, whatever we disagree on, we're coming at it with full hearts. And it is finding those communities, I think, that is more possible today, maybe than at any point in history. And this is what I mean about acting from the bottom up. It's finding what I like to call your pack. People who see you not as a means to an end, because every political party in the history of the world, every big corporation in the history of the world, sees you as a means to an end. On the other hand, your pack, the people who see you as an autonomous human being, as an end in itself, man, we find those communities, we make those communities, and then we act together to have these sort of conversations like you're having on with your microphone, Phil, right? Like I'm having with mine. And we do this, and this is what I mean about the long game. It attracts more and more people. More and more people come and join these communities. And the communities join with each other. This is how real change happens in the world, Phil. You're at the forefront of it. I'm at the forefront of it. And it all happens where you've got a microphone, where nobody can force you to turn it off, and you speak your truth from a full heart, and you'll attract other people who want to hear what you have to say. It's happening, Phil. And man, it gives me, it happens with young people. It happens with people our age. It's what keeps me going. It's what keeps me going after 12 years. I started writing and doing all this stuff from a really dark place because I felt so alone. Phil, you ain't alone. and knowing that and knowing that there are Phil Backs out there, right? And there are Ben Hunts out here. It's what keeps the flame going, Phil. It really is.
I love that. Well, I want to talk about corruption. You love to expose bullshit. You read someone for a long time, I think you can kind of get to know them. I'm going to guess that it is your favorite thing to expose bullshit. You've brought up...
It's the way I'm wired. It's the way I'm wired, Phil. It really is. It's why when I ran my hedge fund, I ran the short book, right? That was my thing, right? And it's not fun, right? Most short sellers I know are kind of miserable, curmudgeonly people because we just see the flaws, right? And it's the way. I was talking with Mark Cohodes. You know Mark, right? I mean, a famous short seller. We've done a couple of podcasts together. Mark's just a great guy. I was phoned with him earlier today, and it's just the way we're wired to look for the bullshit and the bullshitters. I like to call them raccoons. To look for the raccoons who infest our world. And to put yourself in a position like you are, Phil, with your microphone and I am with mine, to call them out, right? Because we're not, I'm just not going to, my goal of getting out of the belly of the beast, which, a big asset manager or something like that, is so that you can call out the raccoons. And I think that's really important because I think a lot of people are not wired like me or Mark or maybe like you, Phil, right? They're not wired that way. They want to think the best of people. So they get taken advantage of time after time after time. And yeah, I enjoy it. I'm not going to lie. I love it, Phil. I do.
Yeah, I could tell you do. It's great. Like you said, you have the raccoons. You have different categories of different types of grifts. And, one of the things that you're keen on saying is they're not even pretending anymore, that it's so out in the open. The fraud and the bullshit right now is so out in the open that they're not even pretending. They're not even trying to hide it. It's just in our face. Is this the golden age of fraud?
Yeah, well, that's a phrase. I don't know. Sorry, Jim Chanos, another short seller, right? Another famous short seller, another wonderful human being, right? I think that was his phrase, right? The golden age of fraud. And absolutely. I mean, it's the golden age of fraud, just like these periods of time, these periods of excess are always a golden age of fraud. But I tell you, Phil, here's what I think is kind of different this time right? As relative to the last golden age of fraud. I mean, 2007 was a pretty good time to be a fraudster, right? And before that, 2000 was a pretty good time, or 1999, let's say, was a pretty good time to be a fraudster. I think what's different today, though, about this cyclical golden age of fraud is that the banks can't fail. I think that makes it really different this time. Because, and here's what I mean. So usually, and by usually I mean 07, 08, 99, 2000. You have a big fraud. You get a fraud that gets caught. And let me come back to, how do these frauds get caught? What stops the party? In the past, the break on this has been, oh my God, fraud, or if not outright fraud, then it was just like such egregious bad lending standards or something. You gave a lot of money to someone, they set that money on fire, and now somebody's got to pay the price. Fraudster pays the price. Skilling goes to jail, Enron goes out. But you've typically got the supplier then you've got a response to that. You've got a political response to that. Bear Stearns taken out in the street and shot. Lehman Brothers. BK'd. What's going to happen to Credit Suisse? What's going to happen to Credit Suisse for setting $10 billion of investors' money on fire around Archegos? For setting another probably $10 billion, maybe more, $10 billion on fire with Greensill? What's going to happen to Credit Suisse for paying $9.5 billion in legal fines and settlements just for the laws that they've admitted to breaking, right, over the last 8 years? What's going to happen to Credit Suisse? Is it going to be taken out and shot in the street like it should be? No, of course not. Of course not. When you have banks that cannot fail and a price of money that is zero and the human eternals of greed, my deal is the supplier of fraud, the easy money that is at the root of fraud. This time, there's no break to it. I don't know what's going to break it. We've never been in a period of time, I think, where the primes or the big banks, something happens like on Archegos and they go, oh, well, we really shouldn't do that again. All right, Mr. Hedge Fund, Melvin Capital, okay, do you need 6 turns of leverage or 7? It's a different tempo to the game today, Phil, that it's a different music being played that certainly not in my lifetime, and frankly not in anything I've read or have memory of that I can draw any analogy to. So it's not just the fraudsters, right? It's not just the Lex Greensills. It's not just the Jeff Skillings. It's not just the Wongs of the world, right? It is the supplier. It is the provider. It is the facilitator of easy money that plays an enormous role in these cycles. And I don't know what stops that.
I mean, it's not just the easy money. It's not just flooding the system with money, with no cost money. You've also got the antitrust regulators are on total vacation. I mean, they have filled those offices with people who come from the companies they're supposed to regulate. The regulators are, we talk about the open door. I've never seen anything like it before. The head of the SEC just got, it's nonstop. Everyone's got a seat at BlackRock waiting for them once they've, had a nice, easy turn on.
It's the Citadel Full Employment Act, right? or these regulatory bodies. That's what it is, right? And so gets back to that point about the business of Wall Street is flow. It is asset flows. It is trading flows. And so you're Ken Griffin, and I can have a hedge fund where I make money through price. Screw that. Let me set up a securities business where I make money through flow. Because I don't care if the price goes up. I don't care if the price goes down. You're just paying me. I am the toll keeper This is my bridge, and you're going over that bridge millions of times a day. Pay the man. And this is what the system has become. In every aspect of our markets, it's been to achieve scale and control over flow. So you're exactly right, Phil. It's the easy money. It's banks that where there is no death penalty for egregious behavior, and a regulatory environment that is laughable. And you put that all together, and again, I don't know how it stops. I really don't, which is, on the one hand, should give you pause about, I think it's maybe a good thing for kind of idiosyncratic stock pickers, right? Because maybe you can try to find the next green sill or the like. But on the other hand, man, it's hard to see how it stops, Phil.
It's hard to see how it stops, and we don't know what's coming. And you add to everything we've been talking about another concept that you've written about, which is the severing of the relationship between, let's say, taxes and spending, between Social Security paid and Social Security benefits, between a company valuation and a company fundamentals and the company price. These things are all floating away. They're untethered from where they need to be, from where they have historically been. So you've got this free money and everything float around. And what is there to fill the gap? Well, brings us back to narratives. There are narratives there to fill the gap and to tell us. Narrative
fills the gap. That's exactly the way to say it, Phil. I don't want to be the grumpy grandpa here, Bill, right? I share, believe me, I share your anger. But I keep trying to think, okay, well, what can reconnect us, meaning you and me, the people listening to this podcast, what can reconnect us with what's real, right? Both as investors and just as human freaking beings. And I think, I don't know, but I think there are some things happening in the world today that are going to push us back to the real. I think that there is a significant change. Use this word earlier. I love this word, the zeitgeist, the water in which we swim, the spirit of the age. I think inflation expectations are growing now. I think inflation expectations are well-rooted, to use an economic term, right, in autos and housing in the United States. And when it comes to the real economy, when it comes to what's real for most people's lives, economic lives in the United States, that's it, man. It's autos, it's your house and your car. And this is the lesson I learned in 2007, which led to us having a great 2008 in our hedge fund. When cars and houses rolled over in Q4 of 2007, I didn't care what the narratives were, Phil. It didn't matter, because ultimately, and there have only been a couple of times in my life where I felt this in my bones, where the disparity between real world and market world was so great, and that real world, there was a gravity to it that was going to pull market world to it. I'm feeling that again, Phil, not from a price collapse, but from prices taking off. And the Fed can talk all they want about, oh, we've got the tools, to handle inflation. That's just a crock, Phil. It's a crock, right? We saw what happened in Q4 of 18, right? When we tried to do a little bit of tightening, right? And the market went crazy. Politics went crazy. I remember Christmas Day, right? Powell's called for his breakfast meeting with the Donald. And all of a sudden it's, oh, well, no. We really didn't mean to do any sort of tightening. We've got to stop that. They've got the tools. They've got the theoretical tools, but they don't have the political tools to do this. So, Phil, I do think that there's some things happening in the world for which the storytelling, the narratives of the Fed's got your back and it's easy money forever, and it's nominal growth and infinite duration stories, because that's what Tesla is, right? It's a story. It's a beautiful story. It's a story of infinite duration and rocket ships to Mars and battery. It's all those stories, right? They're infinite duration stories. And when inflation expectations go up and the price of money, the expectation of the price of money goes up, infinite duration stories don't work. They don't work. So this is where I think we're going, Phil, and it frankly gives me a little hope, right, of reconnecting real world and market world. And I think if we combine that with just acting in our own personal lives to help your neighbor, to find people who you can speak freely in front of, and they know they can speak freely in front of you, and neither one of us is going to think you're a bad person, taking those actions at both the micro scale and seeing what I think is happening at the macro scale. I don't want to end this podcast being all gloom and a downer, Phil. I think there really is hope to reconnect with what's real.
I think there is as well. I think there's a lot of people longing for that, and I think the market tends to correct, right? The market in the market and the human market and the market of ideas. So I think it's a beautiful place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us again. And where can people learn more about everything you're working on?
I'm all Epsilon Theory all the time. So Twitter at Epsilon Theory, epsilontheory.com. You can find it anywhere Epsilon Theory products are sold. And so, podcast, stuff on the website, all that good stuff, Phil. Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to our listeners for your time and attention. We'll be back next week.
Thank you for listening to the Phil Bach Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment to drop a review. This show was published for entertainment purposes only and is not investment advice. Please contact a licensed professional before making any investments. Some of the securities discussed on the show may be owned by its participants. Opinions expressed on the show may not reflect those of their employers. Stay hungry and stay foolish.